Hola, it's Beto here, your daily divinity coach, here for episode number 36 of my weekly series, Sunday Weekly Revival. I'm going to go ahead and tag some friends. If you're watching the recorded video, please feel free to go ahead and fast forward a few minutes while I tag some friends and we get a live audience going here. So just going to tag some friends so we can get a live audience going. So again, if you're watching the recorded video, feel free to go ahead and fast forward a few minutes. Just going to tag some friends and see if we can't get a nice audience going for today's episode. Just seeing who's out there, who's live, who might be available to join. Perfect. So again, just tagging some friends. So if you're watching and you want to the recorded video and you want to go ahead and fast forward a few minutes, feel free to do so while I tag some friends and we get an audience going here today. So again, just tagging some friends, seeing who's out there who might be available to join us today. Perfect. So just checking and seeing who's live right now. Awesome. Looks like there could be quite a few joining. Perfect. So again, just tagging some friends here and we'll get started in a little bit. See who else we want to invite. Just finishing this up and we'll get started real soon here. Seeing who's live. Perfect. Awesome. So I'm just going to go ahead and tag one or two more and then we'll get started. Perfect. All right, looks like we got Danny, Emmylou, if you can throw some hearts in the air or some waves or whatever, just so that I know my sound is working. Just want to do a quick sound check. That would be greatly appreciated. So shout out to Emmylou, Danny, Emmylou, if you can just throw some hearts or some waves or something to let me know that you hear me and that, perfect, there we go. Awesome, greatly appreciated. So I apologize, I'm running a couple minutes late here. I was just on Instagram finishing up, but it's going to be a wild ride today, so you're going to want to buckle your seatbelts. We're going to go through a lot of content, a lot of information, but it's going to be epic. Today's episode number 36 of my weekly series, Sunday Weekly Revival. Episode number 36 is entitled "Taking It to the Streets." Yes, that famous song by the Doobie Brothers, and the roots of all in spirituality. Today is Saturday. It's not Saturday, it's Sunday, March 21st, 2021. Happy spring. I am Beto, your daily divinity coach, and happy to be here. If you're watching the recorded video, I'm just going to give a brief introduction, about 2 minutes, and then we'll get started on the content. So feel free to fast forward 2 minutes if you like. So again, my name is Beto. I'm your daily divinity coach here for episode number 36 of my weekly series, Sunday Weekly Revival. A little bit about me. I post daily on social media here on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, just like a paragraph. I call it Daily Divinity Coaching. And then I also, every Sunday, I'm live. I'm here on Facebook Live, and then prior, I'm on Instagram Live for about 30 minutes for my Sunday Weekly Revival every Sunday, with the exception of the first Sunday of the month. I'm still here with you live, but on the first Sunday of the month, instead of preparing content and delivering content, I actually take your questions as the content, pre-submitted questions, and deliver thoughtful responses. And I call that my monthly mailbag. But regardless, I'm here every Sunday. So in addition to the daily divinity coaching and the Sunday shows, I also produce bracelets, these rubber bracelets here. And I know it's hard to see, but there's a gray bracelet that reads Manifest Justice, a black one that reads Manifest Immortality, and a blue one that reads Manifest Abundance. And I give them away for free. Always free shipping in the U.S. and until the end of March, free shipping anywhere in Europe or North America. So if you haven't received your bracelets, reach out and I'll put a set in the mail for you. I just need a name and an address. If you want them to go to a friend or a family member that doesn't live near you, just go ahead and get me their name and address. I'm happy to ship that out. I've done it before. And you can IM me, you can DM me. If you have my phone number, text me. You can even visit my website, dailydivinitycoach.com, where you can pull down an order form and submit that as well. A little bit more about me. I am a Master Divinity. a graduate of Harvard University Divinity School, where I studied with great scholars like Cornel West and David Carrasco. Actually, they're both my advisors at Divinity School. I also, since the age of 10, right, I'm a boxing guy, right, a boxing fan. I actually worked in the industry. I was a media. I worked media as a ringside correspondent for Fight News for a number of years when I lived in Las Vegas. But anyhow, they always talk about boxers like Oscar De La Hoya and Floyd Mayweather and how they started when they were kids, right? They became these great boxers, right? These icons, really. And so I actually started not boxing at the age of 10, but being tutored in the law of attraction by my mother. So I talk about the law of attraction during these episodes. I talk about liberation theology, social justice. That's what I was introduced to in undergrad, what I studied in divinity school and seminary. And I also talk about anti-aging, being ageless, manifesting immortality, which was a 10-year self-study. It's really about street smarts. I just, did a self-study, talking to people, reading articles here and there. And a lot was just talking to people and stuff like that. And, reflecting, thinking back on what I'd been taught about theology and ancient texts and ancient wisdom, my own oral history, of the Mexica Azteca, and whatnot, thinking about the fifth world. And so that's how I came up with that piece of what I teach, or that subject. So anyhow, that's enough about me, although most of this episode is going to be about me. So we're going to, do a little something different in today's episode. And we're going to be talking about social location, but we're first going to start by talking about that famous Doobie Brothers song, the rock band, the Doobie Brothers of the 1970s. But, they went on for a long time, the Doobie Brothers. I think they might even still be playing. I'm not sure. But anyhow, Taking It to the Streets, right? That famous song. The song was written in 1976 by the Doobie Brothers keyboardist and lead singer, Michael McDonald, who joined the band the previous year. He joined the band in 75, and he, produced the song and wrote the song, Taking It to the Streets, in 76. The song actually popularized the phrase, taking it to the streets, which means taking a message or bringing a message directly to the people. And it's often used in politics, right, to describe grassroots campaigning. So people like my friend and workout partner and my immortality attorney, Dave Nisley, he was a mayor of his town in New Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. After he graduated Harvard, he went back, to his hometown in Pennsylvania, and he ran for mayor. And he would knock on doors. He's taking his message to the streets. This is a young kid. He's like in his 20s still. He ended up winning. He became mayor. It was like a landslide victory. But he took the message to the streets. And I remember he was telling me once that there was one woman in his town who didn't vote for him. And he asked why. And apparently she wasn't like home when he knocked on the door. She's like, "You never asked for my vote." So anyhow, Taking It to the Streets by the Doobie Brothers popularized that phrase, right? Before, that phrase really wasn't used. It was rarely seen in print. So it became this popular phrase. So what was the song about? Well, the lyrics derived from a conversation between Michael and his sister Maureen, the McDonald's, about how society was letting poor people fall through the cracks. And so it could be applied not just in the U.S., but anywhere, right? Society letting poor people fall through the cracks. And so McDonald wanted the song to have a gospel feel to it. And so what he did is he actually had the band members would be the ones singing the chorus melody. And then he would ad-lib behind the melody. So it had this really nice gospel feel to it. A band fact for some of you might not know, some of you might know, but this is a band fact. In 1971, the Doobie Brothers actually decided to adopt the dual drummers. That dual drummer sound that had become popularized by bands like the Grateful Dead, the Allman Brothers. And so they actually auditioned Michael Hosick, and he won the spot, and he ended up joining the band alongside the original drummer, or the founding drummer, John Hartman. And they formed the dual drummers of the Doobie Brothers. Why it's interesting to me is because Michael Hosick was actually a family friend. May he rest in peace. He died in 2012 at the young age of 65. He was a family friend, and for quite a spell there in the 80s, he would come and participate in our family's Friday night prayer meetings, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But he'd come at other times too. He'd just come and hang out. Sometimes he'd come in the morning and bring donuts. He's working on a home, so he wasn't doing a lot of, he wasn't traveling and stuff at that time. And so he'd come, bring donuts, in the summer, and we'd play Frisbee and stuff like that. So he was just a really good family friend. And so that's an interesting fact about the band, that dual drummers piece. So most of this, what I want to do for most of this episode is talk about social location. And I've mentioned this in a past episode, that no one is universal. Not even the great teacher, right? The great teacher came from somewhere. He had a social location. We all speak from a social location. So what is a social location? Social location is defined as our gender, right? Our race, ethnicity, our sexual orientation, and our geographic location, right? Did I mention religion? But, our religion or spirituality as well. So I say that to say this, that I was not born a pluralist. I was not born using inclusive language like the divine and the great teacher. I evolved, right? I evolved into what you see now, right? I was actually born and baptized Catholic. If you've flown into San Francisco International Airport, SFO, you've flown into my hometown, or the place where I spent most of my childhood. Not all of my childhood, but most of my childhood. And it was in that town that my parents attended Sunday Mass at Our Lady of Angels, right? We called it OLA, Our Lady of Angels. And yeah, we'd attend Sunday Mass there. That's where I attended CCD. That's where I made my first communion. It was our neighborhood Catholic church. And in my neighborhood, this was in the 1970s, it was almost exclusively Catholic and Jewish. I honestly did not meet a Protestant until I went to junior high school. This kid, he was Lutheran, and it blew my mind, right? I thought, for the most part, everybody was like Catholic or Jewish. I mean, I think there's one family that practiced Islam, but that was like it, right? I'd never met a Protestant before. He was Lutheran, I'd pepper him with questions and stuff because I was trying to get my head around what a Lutheran was. Interestingly enough, it would be a short while after that my parents would become Protestants themselves. So what happened is that my father had a conversion experience, right? It was like a midlife crisis / conversion experience thing that happened with him. And so anyway, and it happened at a Mass there at Our Lady of Angels. And he determined that he wanted to be, he was going to be, not just wanted to be, but was going to be a better husband. That was really the crux of it, because the dude he wasn't a great husband at that time. But also he wanted to be a better family man. He wasn't a bad family man, but he wanted to be better, right? But it was really about being a better husband. So my parents, as a result of this, religious, experience, they ended up becoming what they called charismatic Catholics at the time. And it was a movement. There was like a big movement going on in the Catholic Church. They became these charismatic Catholics who practiced what they called charismatic worship. So outside of Mass, these Catholics would have prayer meetings. And these prayer meetings would feature prophecy, faith healing, speaking in tongues, or what they would call being baptized in the Spirit, or being baptized in the Holy Spirit. And so my daddy, he started practicing faith healing, and he actually became pretty good at it. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but the book that he just recently wrote about his experiences with miracles and faith healing actually is being published. He found a big publisher, and he signed a book contract, and they're actually publishing his book. But he always had a day job. I mentioned this before. I have a day job, right? He always had a day job while he was doing this. So anyway, they're active in this Catholic charismatic movement. They started actually doing prayer meetings at their own home and in our home, and these lasted for about 7-8 years, circa 1979 to 1987. And interestingly enough, my father, he never tutored me in faith healing. Now, I have been asked on a couple of occasions by a couple of congregations too. One was primarily white, and the other is almost all Dominican, Central American, and Puerto Rican. That was down in Connecticut. This was up here. The other one, the mostly white one, was up here in Boston. But these congregations, these churches actually asked me to come do faith healing services. And so I've done them, but it wasn't what I was tutored in, right? He didn't like tutor me in that. But I've done them before when asked. Likewise, my grandfather, who practiced indigenous Mexican healing rituals, also never tutored me in those rituals. He learned them from his mother, and it was passed down in his family, but I was never tutored. What I was tutored in was the law of attraction and scientific prayer by my mother, who's still my prayer partner to this day. When they're getting involved in this charismatic Catholic movement, my dad was getting into the faith healing and whatnot. My mom got into the law of attraction and scientific prayer, and so that's what she tutored me in, and that's why I talk about that, with authority, because age of 10, right? Like I said, De La Hoya, Mayweather, they were kids, right? When they started boxing, I started with the law of attraction at age of 10. So anyhow, our family ended up moving from, that San Francisco area down about 30 miles, 40 miles down to San Jose, which is now a big town, right? Over 1 million people, right? They call it the capital of Silicon Valley or whatever, the heart of Silicon Valley. So that's actually where I attended high school and, met my friends who are still my friends today. Santa Clara University, where I went to university, is down in that area. And also at that time when we moved down there, my parents also left the Catholic church that we're attending, and they joined a Protestant church, an independent Protestant church. It's called Crossroads Bible Church, and it's pastored by a man by the name of Rich Marshall. Good guy. I mean, Rich Marshall is like, one of those pastors, just has a really good heart and really good person. And I knew his kids. His kids were around my age. His daughter actually attended a U2 concert, the band U2, the famous band U2. This was back in the mid-early 80s. She went with us and saw U2. So, we knew their family. They knew us and whatnot. And actually, Pastor Rich, he's not a pastor anymore. He's like, I think, an evangelist. But anyhow, he is actually helping my father with his book. He wrote the foreword to his book, and he's going to help promote the book. Rich has like this thing he does on TV, and it's broadcast internationally. He's going to have my father come. They're going to talk about his book and stuff like that. So anyway, good guy. I think he lives in Denver now. So anyhow, near the end of my high school days, my parents decided that they were going to leave the Crossroads Bible Church, where I had a lot of friends and whatnot. My sister did too, and join a mega church, Cathedral of Faith. The reason why is because Crossroads really wasn't into the charismatic, like Pentecostal thing, but Cathedral of Faith was. And so this mega church was pastored by Kenny Foreman. Interestingly enough, my father knew Kenny Foreman from way back in the 70s. My father ran a Cadillac dealership in San Francisco, and Kenny Foreman liked Cadillacs. He would buy and sell Cadillacs. He liked driving them and whatnot. And so my dad would do business with Kenny Foreman. And so many years later, he ends up joining Kenny Foreman's megachurch, right? The Cathedral of Faith, which, in the 70s, Kenny Foreman didn't have a megachurch. He actually, grew it through the years. So anyhow, again, God, may he rest in peace. Kenny Foreman's also passed now. So back to me. So I attended mostly public schools, K to 12. With a little bit of an exception there, but mostly public schools, K to 12. But I ended up attending a Catholic or Jesuit university, Santa Clara University. And it was at Santa Clara University that I was introduced to liberation theology. An event took place, international event, on November 16, 1989, tragic event. An elite unit of the Salvadorian army ended up murdering 6 Jesuit priests who are also scholars. They taught at the University of Central America. 6 Jesuits, their housekeeper and their housekeeper's daughter. I mean, just a horrific, tragic thing that happened. And it was a big deal on my campus, right? Because Santa Clara University, we had connections with the university in Central America, right? We're a Jesuit university. Jesuit priests were murdered. Some of the Jesuits on our campus knew the Jesuits who were murdered and whatnot. So it was like this big deal. Why were they murdered? Like, why would the Salvadorian army target, these priests? Well, these priests were talking out against the civil war that was taking place in El Salvador that had left 75,000 men, women, and children dead. Mostly civilians had died. And, these priests were about liberation theology at the end of the day. And so they wanted an end to this brutal civil war. And so they were targeted and tragically, horrifically murdered along with their housekeeper and the housekeeper's daughter. So it was there, it was at that time that, I was introduced to liberation theology. I wanted to learn what was going on and started studying and stuff like that. So I became politicized there on my university campus. And I ended up joining MECHA. MECHA stands for Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. The Chicano Student Union on our campus, and in many campuses throughout California and the Southwest, and even nationally. But I think it was primarily the Southwest, and a lot. I mean, it was a big deal, especially at that time in California. And the student organization was actually started in 1969 in Santa Barbara, but it had spread, right? And the idea was, we were active in rallying for like more Chicano studies or Chicano studies programs and departments and stuff like that. But we were also very interested in connecting the university with the community. And so while a student, I became involved in as a volunteer for the local 1877, the Service Employee International Union's Justice for Janitor campaign. And at that time, they were organizing a campaign, and they wanted Apple, right, the big Apple computer, right, Steve Jobs and Wozniak, the big Apple computer to use union janitors, right? So the union janitors would have more pay and they'd have more benefits and whatnot. And so I became active, and I actually went like to different campuses around, the San Francisco Bay Area, and talked to different MECHA chapters and led a rally, actually appeared on TV. And, and anyhow, the campaign was successful. Apple decided to do it. They went with the union janitors, and it was like this big to do, right? I mean, there's even like a big, I think it was a full page article in one of the New York dailies and whatnot. So I was like, wow, like I was part of this successful campaign. But what that really did is it gave me a burning desire to want to take it to the streets, right? Take this message to the streets. That's why I entitled the episode, Taking It to the Streets, The Roots of All in Spirituality. So this was like a pivotal moment for me. And so I was involved with the MECHA chapter there on my university, Santa Clara University, and the neighboring university, San Jose State University. My buddy Carlos, who, we've been friends since we were like 14, 15, he was actually co-chair of the MECHA chapter on his campus. And so we started talking, we're like, we should take this to the streets. And so we ended up forming this group called it's called MECHA Underground, and there's 7 of us, and we did like a newsletter, and then we would just go to the streets. We'd like walk the barrios, right, the neighborhoods, and just start talking to people. And then we noticed like the young kids, like the high school age kids, like they'd want to talk to us, and we'd talk and stuff like that. And it was awesome. It was cool. Like we felt super cool. And anyhow, we were in this one neighborhood, and it was in West San Jose. Called the Alma neighborhood. It's right next to the Garden neighborhood. And these kids, they would call themselves, there's some, there's gang activity in that area. And so the kids call themselves West Side Mob. And if you know San Jose, up just a little ways there in the Garden neighborhood, the kids would call themselves Barrio Horseshoe. There's some gang activity there. But anyhow, that wasn't our message. Our message was about, organizing and making a change for your community and stuff like that. So these kids, they told us, they said, hey, look, we like what you're saying, and we want you to help us. Like, how can we be of assistance? They said, well, we have a youth center here in our neighborhood, and it got closed down. So this was like the late 80s, early 90s, and there's a recession going on. And so the city of San Jose had cut the budget for this youth center. And they said, we want to get it back up and running. So we organized, we went door to door talking to people. We ended up organizing like this big rally, and a lot of kids and people from the community, parents and whatnot, came out for this rally. And it's like near the beginning of the rally, and I was actually driving, I was on the way, but the San Jose Police Department cops showed up, and because they thought like it was gang related, right? I guess they'd never seen Chicanos organizing before. They thought it was gang related, and so anyhow, a couple of the kids apparently, they got, harassed and physically harassed by the police. One of our, one of our organizers, his father is a lawyer, so his dad got involved in that case. And then I ended up getting a message that the city of San Jose wanted to negotiate. They wanted to meet. They wanted to sit down with us. So Carlos, myself, and 3 of the high school kids in that area got together and decided what we're going to ask for. And so we met. They sent the head of the head or deputy head of the Parks and Recreation Department. They had their budget, right? The city budget person there, one of their budget people there. And so we met and we talked, and anyhow, we ended up negotiating to reopen the youth center, the Alma Youth Center. And I ended up working there. Carlos ended up working there. We hired a couple of kids. I was also teaching at the time. I was teaching at an urban high school in East San Jose, Overfelt High School, if you know the area. I was teaching there, and I was working at the Alma Center. And so I was getting to know a lot of the people in the community in different parts of the community throughout the city. And so it was at that time that I decided to join Victory Outreach. So I kind of separated from my parents' church and joined Victory Outreach. And Victory Outreach, if you know, was started in 1967 in East LA, right? In East LA, the Chicano part of Los Angeles, by a gentleman by the name of Sonny Arganzoni. And Sonny Arganzoni has his roots in New York City. He's actually from New York City. And he'd been discipled in Teen Challenge. And Teen Challenge had started like late 50s, early 60s in New York City by a gentleman by the name of David Wilkerson. And David Wilkerson, he's an interesting character. He's just, at the time, he was just like this young, 20-something kid, young man, skinny, right, white kid from Phillips, he's ministering in Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania. And he had this like burning desire, this calling to minister in New York City to gang members and drug addicts. And he had no background at all in any of that, right? None. So he ends up going and he starts this ministry called Teen Challenge, which was like a para ministry, a para church ministry of Assemblies of God. He's a Pentecostal priest, right? He's, into everything I talked about my parents were into, right? Faith, healing, and all that kind of stuff. Speaking in tongues and prophecy. So anyway, he ends up in the streets of New York City, and he's working with these young people, and he meets a young gang member by the name of Nicky Cruz. And Nicky Cruz, Puerto Rican roots in New York City, a real New Yorican. And Nicky Cruz becomes one of his early converts and really his most popular convert. And so David Wilkerson documented their experiences. The book was called The Cross and the Switchblade. Their experiences were documented in this book, which later became a movie. And it was released in 1963, sold 15 million copies, translated into over 30 languages around the world. So, really, really popular story. But that was, Sonny Arganzoni's roots. So when he moved to, East LA and started his church in 67, that's where he was coming from. And so anyhow, out of Victory Outreach, there's a gentleman by the name of Ed Morales, popularly known as Pastor Ed. And Pastor Ed was a Vietnam vet. He's a Vietnam vet. He had a heroin problem. When he was younger, he was involved in the neighborhood gang. So he joins Victory Outreach in East LA and gets cleaned up, right? He gets cleaned up, good citizen, ready to do good work, help young people, help people overcome, addiction and, get out of the gangs and do positive things. So Ed ends up being sent by Sonny up to San Jose, right? To the Bay Area. And he starts his church there in San Jose. And so it's the early 80s, and Pastor Ed became a legend. And he's rest in peace now. He's passed on. But he became a legend because what he did is he came out with this play, which was also turned into a movie called The Duke of Earl. And they would do this play, and it was about, gang members that had religious conversion, went on to live good lives, that type of thing. But it was really like authentic because it was what Pastor Ed lived, and so many of his converts lived this experience, right? And so they would do it not only in San Jose where it started, but they would take it to like Denver and San Antonio, San Diego, other places, and I think even internationally. And it would get like huge audiences, right? Like 5,000, 10,000. My uncle, my tío Eddie Jimenez, who actually watches my shows, he was part of the Duke of Earl band for a number of years. And the play would start like it would be, it'd be like 5,000, 10,000 people in like this auditorium. They dim the lights and it'd be like complete silence. And my tío Eddie, my uncle Eddie would start playing he's a percussionist, and he'd play the cowbell, right? To the war song, right? Lowrider. And that's how it would start. And then, and then everything, the lights would come on and, everybody would erupt, right? Because everybody knew the song. if you don't know the song, it's also the introduction to the George Lopez show, right? The song by War, Lowrider. So anyhow, these plays were huge, right? In the Chicano community, not just in San Jose, but like throughout the Southwest and in other parts too. Victory Outreach became international, like, Mexico City and Sao Paulo and stuff, they became international. When I joined the church, they looked at me and they got to know me a little bit and they're like, man, you'd be perfect for prison ministry. I'm like, why? They're like, well, you got no record, right? I'd never been in prison, actually never been arrested, been harassed, but never arrested, right? They're like, yeah, you'd be, not only that, but you're so clean, like, you really should be working with the youth because, you got to have a clean record to go work with the youth in the youth prisons and whatnot. So I'm like, all right, let's do it. So I signed up and so I became part of their prison ministry. And when I was a volunteer assistant prison chaplain, which was my title, the chaplain that I was working under, who was the full-time chaplain, it was her job. She actually was employed by the county. She was actually from here. She was from Boston. She had gone to divinity school. Here, where I'm at now in Cambridge. And so she's seen the work I did with the young people, because sadly, a lot of the young people that were locked up, I knew them through my work as a high school teacher in the east side of San Jose at Overfell High School, through the Alma Center, my work in the community, just being out in the community. I actually knew, it was sad. I knew some of those kids in there. Actually, there's people who met me, or not just met me, but people I ministered in there who actually watched these shows. These Sunday weekly revivals. So it was like a natural thing for me to be working with those kids. And it was more like counseling, right? Just talking to the kids and stuff. So anyway, she influenced me. That was the first person who put the seed in my head. Like, you should go to divinity school. You should go to seminary. So anyhow, during that time, and I was with Victory Outreach for 8 years. During that time, I got to know Pastor Ed really well. I got to know his cousin really well, Pastor Herb Morales. He was the pastor of Victory Outreach in Salinas. He'd come from the church in San Jose, went to Salinas, started church there. He actually lived on the same block as the Honda dealership that my dad was running at the time in the 90s, early 90s and mid 90s. And they became friends. I got to know him really well. His daughter actually worked for my dad. I actually worked for my dad in the summers when I was going to divinity school. So anyway, got to know him really well, got to know Pastor Ed really well. And I'd been working meeting, sometimes in his office, sometimes over breakfast or lunch, because Pastor Ed was interested. He's interested in the Chicano studies piece and social justice and stuff like that. And we were always like working, trying to figure out how we can, take that piece, right, to influence the theology of and the work that he was doing with Victory Outreach. Unfortunately, it never happened. I mean, we were close at one point. We were really close because he had an idea for a different type of play beyond Duke of Earl, in which he could integrate some of this stuff, right? Some of the, the match of the kind of study, the social justice, liberation theology piece. But unfortunately, it never happened. And after 8 years, I ended up leaving the church. And a big part of that was because, and this is my experience, I'm coming from my experience, and the church was successful. So, regardless of us not, of that reform piece taking place where the Chicano study and the social justice was never really incorporated, in the work that Pastor Ed was doing, and again, rest his soul. His church was successful. He had like 500 members. I think they're like over 1,000 now. And the home church had thousands of members. So they didn't really need anything, right? They didn't really need to integrate this piece. They're having success and they're doing great work and their mission was great and everything else. So they didn't really need it. But for me personally, I just, again, this is, my personal perspective. I just felt like the culture wars, right, which was rooted in the religious right, just had affected the theology in such a way that, I just didn't feel comfortable being part of the organization anymore. And so what a lot of people, and I want to end with this, what a lot of people don't know about the religious right is that, and they had such an impact on Pentecostal churches, the charismatic movement, evangelical churches. What people don't know is they think that the religious right started as a reaction to Roe v. Wade, right? The landmark Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade. That's not the case. It wasn't a reaction to Roe v. Wade. Actually, when Roe v. Wade was passed by the Supreme Court, or that decision came down, most the evangelicals and Protestants, they seen it as like a non-issue. They seen it like as a Catholic thing. Like they didn't there's really no reaction. They didn't go up in arms or nothing like that. Like they just, oh, that's a Catholic thing, Roe v. Wade. What affected the religious right, the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, was another decision, and that decision was about the IRS, about tax-exempt status. What happened was, in this decision called Green versus Connolly, back in 1972, the government determined that any institution that was practicing segregation, right, dividing people, keeping people apart, couldn't have tax-exempt status. And so there's a university, Bob Jones University, an independent, evangelical, non-denominational university in Greenville, South Carolina, that practiced segregation. Up until the 1970s, early 1970s, very early 1970s, they denied admission to African Americans. Christian organization, right? But it had its roots in slavery, right? And before the Civil War, most ministers, right, most Protestant ministers were either didn't speak out against slavery or was actually supporting it, right? The abolitionist movement wasn't a huge movement as many would assume. So anyway, they had their roots in that, and so anyhow, they were upset, right? And the IRS came after them, right? They're like, you guys segregate, you deny admission to African Americans. They ended up making some concessions. They started letting accepting admission or offering admission to African Americans, but they still, weren't there, right? They actually, interracial dating was forbidden on campus. I mean, it's wild to think, but that was the 1970s at Bob Jones University. So anyway, Bob Jones ended up filing suit against the IRS and the government, and it went to the Supreme Court back in 82, 83. It went that high. The Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan, actually initially wanted to defend Bob Jones University in this suit, this case that went to the Supreme Court. Ended up backpedaling, right? Ended up backpedaling and saying no, because public outcry was like you can't do that, right? So they ended up not doing that, but initially that's what they wanted to do. So ends up that and this was in 1983. The Supreme Court votes against Bob Jones University. It was 8-1. 8 Supreme Court justices said no, you guys are crazy. 1 dissented, right? It was for Bob Jones University. That justice was William Rehnquist. He ended up being promoted shortly thereafter by the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan, to Chief Justice. That was Reagan's guy, right? So that's the roots of the religious right, was segregation. And but what they did was that, the religious right understood that they couldn't take that, this idea of like religious freedom, so that we could do, practice segregation. They knew that they couldn't take that to the people, right? That they wouldn't get mass appeal. There's no mass support, mass appeal around that, right? So what they did is, but they wanted to create a broad movement nonetheless. And so they were looking at different issues that they could take on, right? This is Jerry Falwell, the moral majority, the religious right. And so they landed on abortion, Roe v. Wade. Later, this wasn't like right after it took place. This was like later. They landed on that decision. They initially thought about, what about the women's movement? Can we get a broad majority against the women's movement? They couldn't do it. But they thought with the Roe v. Wade thing they could, because they already had, like, the Catholics were already, on board to be, pro-life. And they thought if they can get, the evangelicals on board who, really just saw it as a Catholic issue, they could build this broad base of support. Because again, at the time, the evangelicals and the Protestants were really not, they weren't up in arms. There was no reaction. So they went about that business and they created these cultural wars, because it wasn't just about that one issue, right? It wasn't just about Roe v. Wade. They went off in all these culture wars, and they're fourth world people, right? They're these lords of scarcity, these fourth world rulers that understood that if we could divide and conquer people, right? That's how you grow in the fourth world, and they did it. They conquered, they divided people, and through those divisions, creating those culture wars, that's how they became the moral majority. And that's, evangelicals, they're the majority of Protestants now in the U.S. And so anyway, that's what, in the end, that's what caused me to leave Victory Outreach. And again, great mission, they had a lot of success, but I couldn't, after 8 years, I just couldn't do it anymore. I was just too much into the social justice, liberation theology. I mean, I'm a whole comprehensive person, right? And so later on, I ended up joining a mainline denomination, the United Church of Christ, which is all about social justice and liberation theology and whatnot. But that had its own issues, right? With attendance declining. I mean, the church I was involved in here locally, like at one time they had like 500 members. Like when I was involved, there's like 50, 60 people. I mean, I was a deacon for a couple of years, and we're doing more funerals than we were baptisms or marriages. So anyhow, I can talk about that mainline decline in another episode, but I know I'm over time now. But I wanted to end here. I'm so grateful for you. So grateful for this opportunity to present this information. I know it's a little bit different than other Sunday Weekly Revivals when we're usually talking about pop icons like John Lennon and Mr. Cartoon and whatnot. So it's a little bit different this time, but I thought it was an important episode. Again, this was episode 36, Taking It to the Streets, right? The famous Doobie Brothers song, and the roots of all-in spirituality. Today's Sunday, March 21st. Happy spring. Again, grateful for you all. Very, very blessed to be able to offer this information in this episode. And may you have a blessed rest of your day, rest of your Sunday or night, wherever you may be, and hope you can join again next week. I'm going to go ahead and put on my reading glasses and turn this off now. Bye, and hope you can join again next week. Bye-bye.